Hey guys, first regardsman here, and I'll be talking about the current state of Space Marine 2, and to talk about this with me, I have brought on Jefficus. Now, Jeff, we've talked about year 2 for a while now, and as the year 2 roadmap comes to a close, what are your thoughts on the current state of the game?
I think that Space Marine 2 is in a very good place. It's probably in the best position that it's ever been, especially in regards to other Warhammer games, other Warhammer 40k games, and then other Horde shooters as well. The combat has really come a long way since release, and basically every single gameplay structure in Space Marine 2 has evolved or has been reworked since the game hit the market back in September of what is it now, 2024?
Yeah,
Like
2024.
it's come a really long way. And I think that there are a couple of things that are releasing very soon that aren't necessarily going to be a make or break for the game, like for example, Chaos Siege, but I do think that they're going to be extremely important for how Warhammer 40k fans engage with video games.
I think it's pretty rare for us to see a game like this become more popular over time because like Space Marine 2 launched with a very popular release and then it fell off for a bit in that year 1, and now year 2 has really brought back a lot of the players, and the average player retention in this game is significantly higher now than it was in year 1. I think a huge part of this is just that the content is far better now, and like you said, the new siege mode, chaos mode coming out, and other things in year 3. I think year 3 might be even more substantial than this year was, which is kind of insane to say. So it's a pretty crazy thing for 40k fans to like finally have a horde shooter that's properly supported, because as good as Darktide is, the content drops in that game take forever, even in comparison to
Very
Space Marine
slow.
2's. So I think
Mhm.
Space Marine 2 is in a very good spot at the moment, and also very consumer friendly.
Yeah, I think that Saber and Focus have actually done a really good job on capitalizing on what is their most successful release ever. And they're basically just trying to milk the crap out of it, which for us as consumers is great because the monetization model that they have for Space Marine 2 is really not that bad in the grand scheme of things. And it simply translates to more free content for everyone. Because when we look at every single update that hits Space Marine 2, every 1.5 to 2 months, we're getting a new map. We're getting unique operation bosses at the end of about half of the operations that release. Each map is coming with new skins, new heroic weapons, all this stuff that is free for everyone to experience, in addition to the paid cosmetics from the DLCs. So I think that Space Marine 2 is, it's only going to get better with time. And with Saber and Focus being so receptive to community feedback, like, dude, like we are living in the golden age of Space Marine games right now.
I'm glad you brought up the fact that heroic weapons have done a lot for the game. I think heroic weapons are probably the single biggest change for year 2. I know that may sound a little insane, but the heroic grind, I don't really hear a lot of players complain about grinding out accolades, because I think they've done a really good job at giving players the opportunity to like buy the heroic they want first. Because let's say you're like a bulwark player, you don't really have to just grind out like every heroic. You can just buy a Xenophase blade and play with that, and all of the heroic effects are actually way more interesting than like the base weapons in the game in a lot of cases. So I think they've done a really good job at like keeping players around just for these like 3 to 6 new heroics every single patch, and that's been a huge portion of the player retention, like you said before as well. Saber's response to player feedback is way better than most horde shooters. I mean, if you look over at Helldivers 2 with Arrowhead, they would never take feedback like Saber does on their forums or things like that. So I think Saber's done a pretty good job at listening to the community. Maybe they take a while to fix some of the bugs. There are still some game-breaking bugs in Space Marine 2, but for the most part, they've definitely made a huge effort on listening to what players want, and I think it's been showcased in their updates and also just the player retention.
Yeah, dude, and like speaking of accolades, like I know that we as a community will sometimes complain about them kind of being like this weekly chore where the game kind of gets us to log in and do our weeklies, do our dailies and all that. But at the same time, I am that guy who looks at the Black Templar helmet that they add to the accolade shop and I'm like, "Oh, I got to get that." Or the most recently added like Space Wolf helmet, like the champion helmet or whatever. I was like, "Oh, like I gotta get that, dude. Like I gotta farm for it."
Oh, definitely.
And I love how you've got these benchmarks where you do have a reason to log in and play the game, and you have these cosmetics that kind of show other players that you mean business. Like you do play the game a lot. you have a little bit of a trophy, you're wearing it. It's a classic throwback to the old like Halo or Call of Duty days, where when you had specific cosmetics, you're wearing specific pieces of armor, then you kind of meant something in game. You kind of put a lot of time in the game. You've invested, and it's really strange to talk about, but Space Marine 2 kind of brings those feelings back. It really is kind of like this classic trophy system.
I would definitely agree that it does have a classic trophy system in terms of cosmetics. You know, Halo 3 especially, Halo Reach as well, these games had tremendous amounts of cosmetics for just playing the game, and Space Marine 2 is just like that, which is pretty rare in games today. You know, if you look at Dark Tide, the free cosmetic unlocks are incredibly unsubstantial compared to Space Marine 2's, and even though Space Marine 2 bases its entire DLC model around having these cosmetic unlocks and cosmetic purchases, you still get a ton of free options in game, especially with the heroic store, like you said. And I think a huge portion of that is that the accolades grind is what is keeping players around this year between patches, because like we said before, the average player retention in year 2 is significantly higher between those patches, and a huge portion of that is that as we get further into the game's life cycle, there will be so many heroics to unlock, so many heroic cosmetics, that there's going to be a ton for players to work through between the patches on top of the War Gear update. And I think that these two things in particular, with the accolades and the War Gear grind, that's what's going to keep players between patches for quite a while, especially in year 3 between like the new class and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think that as they continue to add more heroic weapons, the replayability factor of the game is going to continue to increase. We already know that we have two melee weapons, not just two weapons, period, but at least two melee weapons and the Absolver bolt pistol coming in year 3, which is a pretty big deal because that translates to 6 more heroic weapons coming to the game as well, 6 more heroic variants. And so the just taking everything that we just talked about with accolades into account, applying that to 6 more variants, 3 more weapons, whatever you want to call it, like that is plenty of replayability, especially if Saber takes it a step further and looks at classes like the Vanguard and the Heavy and the Tactical and do some class restructuring or redesign like they've been teasing they're going to be doing for those classes. And so it almost becomes a completely new experience and almost a pseudo way of approaching a live service game to provide more replayability to a player who's already put hundreds of hours into those classes, or dozens of hours for I think the majority of Space Marine 2's audience, and giving them this kind of like fresh slate. Like, hey, not only is this class stronger or different from how it was the last time you played it, but also you've got like 12 different heroic weapon variants that you could experiment with on the class.
I would also say that when it comes to heroic weapons, we can see Saber move towards moving accolades into all the game modes they possibly can. We might even see an accolades grind in the PvP one day, because I'm pretty sure Saber knows that like a lot of the retention is coming from this accolades grind. So in patch 13, we got the accolades available in the siege mode for the hard weekly and the normal weekly, and then you also lowered down the weekly ever so slightly for like the normal hard stratagems. But like these days, you can actually get more per week in accolades than you could before, because they know that as the game continues, the amount of heroics to unlock, like you said, the 3 new weapons, is going to go up and up. And because of that, players are going to be pretty like daunted, or excuse me, pretty, afraid of the massive grind ahead of them beyond just leveling up their classes. Because coming into the game as a brand new player, which we know will happen a ton this Christmas because the game is coming out on Nintendo Switch 2, that's a pretty daunting thing for players. And when you come to the game and you see all these prestige levels, you see all these heroics, having more options to unlock those accolades independent of like one single game mode, and also having more community events for that, I think we will see a push towards more options for accolades grinding as we go forward. But I think it's probably the single best thing they've done for the game. Heroics especially are very interesting in terms of their heroic perk effects compared to just like the base game weapons, and because of that, I think it's kept players around a lot longer. Now, I'm kind of curious to hear your opinion on patch 12 and 13. These were the last 2 major patches we had for the game. Patch 14 is going to be far smaller, it's just be like heroics and a boss, and because of that, I think as year 2 is winded down, we are really looking at, the patch 15 as a major drop. Do you think patch 12 and 13 were like the biggest changes for the player base in this year?
Oh, dude. I mean, patch 12 is Tech Marine, right?
Yes.
So, Tech Marine represents this evolution of class design where it's Saber recognizing, like, hey, this is how players actually engage with our game, and this is how our classes perform at the highest level. Because when Space Marine 2 came out, you didn't have things like absolute difficulty. Hell, you didn't have lethal difficulty. You didn't have siege mode. You didn't have hard mode siege. You didn't have stratagems. And so the Tech Marine was created with all of those activities in mind. And it gives us a little window of what class design is going to look like whenever they do these class reworks for all these other classes. And it gives us a good idea of what class design is going to look like for the class launching in 2027, and hopefully for whatever is created for Space Marine 3 and whatever other Space Marine games we see in the future. Hopefully they design these classes in a way where they're designed with these kind of ultra endgame activities in mind. And it's very exciting because just the way that the Tech Marine does gun strikes, for example, like it's just so much more fluid than every other class in the game. When it comes to patch 13, I think the introduction of the ultra grinds was really well implemented. It was a little rocky, I will admit at first, with the amount of runs that you had to do
Yeah,
on
100
absolute
absolute missions.
yeah, 100 per class or whatever, but they have since nerfed it, and I do think that the ultra grinds are similar to the accolades, better for the game in the long run because you do have a lot of older players like myself. I'm not a dinosaur by any means, but I do remember those days of classic World of Warcraft or Halo 3 where having really cool armor meant something. Logging in and seeing someone wearing very specific things, having their capes, etc., means like, oh man, this guy is a gamer, a capital G gamer. And people want to spend time in a world or in a setting where they're able to express that. They don't want to log into this game where everything that looks cool is something that you buy from the store. For a lot of us, that means nothing. That has zero value at all.
I would definitely
So
agree
yeah,
that having like a long-term grind for cosmetic unlocks to basically flex on other players, like that's a pretty standard thing in video games. As long as there are like enough substantial unlocks for players of all skill levels and like all a dedication to the game to just properly have their own outfits, I think having like a few cosmetics like the capes hidden behind what is like really not like too much of a difficult grind as much as it is just a long grind is good for like that
right.
dedicated portion of the player base. And like you said before, the absolute missions being like 100 initially as a requirement was a bit excessive, but 50 seems pretty all right. And the custom strats functioning and the hard strats functioning like normal, that does also help out with like players being able to still complete them in a pretty like reasonable amount of time, so they'll never fix that. Now in the future, we are getting the War Gear update part 2 in patch 14. That'll probably round out some like the other requirements, and I imagine they'll be taking that into account because patch 14 will have a public test server, so I don't expect the launch of the requirements for the Ultra Grind ordeals to be as like excessively overtuned as they were initially for this one. But as far as cosmetic unlocks go for the game in the future, I think that the cosmetics for the game are just going to get better over time, and they're going to like slowly implement more long-term grinds for players as the player base like kind of dwindles down to its most dedicated players between patches, which is kind of like is already at now. Now as far as the new classes go, like you were talking about, I agree. The Tech Marine was a very obviously post-launch class. The intricacy of the Tech Marine is, in my opinion, like a top one in the game. He is the most interesting to play, and they have gone back to like classes like Assault and stuff like that, and giving them animation cancels that do make them feel way better. But in terms of like perk tree synergy, perk tree options, I think the Tech Marine is a really good sign for what we can expect from the new class. I think the new class will probably be even better. So I think they're doing a great job as far as that is concerned. And I do think year 3 will probably be better than year 2, because I'm sure year 2 made more money than year 1 did. So because of that, they'll probably be putting more resources into it this time around.
Well, there are a lot of lessons learned for year 3. Like, for example, we're going to get a Cosmetic Head DLC in year 3, and they're not going to half-ass it this time. This Cosmetic Head DLC is going to be worth the 10 or so dollars that you're going to have to pay for it, because their facial animations are going to be fully animated. The voice lines are actually going to be significant. These characters are probably going to actually interact with the characters in your squad in game. Like, they're not going to slack this time. And these are lessons that they kind of had to learn, albeit the hard way, in year 2, so that they could apply them to year 3. And I kind of see that design philosophy shared among every facet of the game. Like, they just keep learning as they keep going along, keep chugging along with Space Marine 2, and that's at the end of the day, that's kind of why the game is getting better and better. Again, Saber is actually doing a very good job of listening to the community. They would not have given those heads, the Space Wolf, the Black Templar, and the Blood Angel, to the community for free if the community hadn't spoken up about it.
That is true, and like I think the community did a great job, like letting their voices be heard on that front. Where the DLC voice heads, like that was really the only major controversy we've had since the initial launch of the game. There have been like some tiny controversies about like certain things not working properly, but as far as like a major pushback from the community, that was it, and they responded in the best way they could, which is like, okay, you have it for free, and like you said, we will most likely have the new head pack be a far more substantial addition if they even decide to go through with it, because I did see like one of the focus community managers say they weren't entirely sure if they wanted to actually do the future head pack release anymore. I'm sure they will, but like they might give it out for free, or they might just put it in like the heroic store, or they're gonna make it a very substantial addition and put it out for like maybe like $8 or something like that. I think players would be fine with that if the voice lines are properly functioning like they expected them to be initially. Now, as far as what this means for Space Marine 3 in terms of lessons learned, I think Space Marine 3, we're probably going to hear news on that next year at some point. I might start to mention it a little bit because
Probably
we'll be
during
like,
Skulls.
yeah, it's probably Skulls next year. We'll hear something on Space Marine 3 because we've been in the, it's a 4-year dev cycle, so we're 2 years in now. And for the most part, I think we're probably not going to see anything for that until middle of year 3 at the earliest. But as far as lessons learned are concerned for that game, I think Space Marine 3 will probably have a more aggressive monetization scheme in terms of cosmetic unlocks, but there'll also be more cosmetic unlocks to be unlocked in the first place. So I think they're probably going to be like really doubling down on that. And I think a lot of the Ultra Grinder deals and stuff like that will also be found on the launch of that game instead.
Well, I think you're already starting to see Space Marine 2 step into the next phase of its life cycle, which is going to be the life cycle where it has to exist in a world alongside Space Marine 3. And what does that look like, right? Well, it looks like Saber is already embracing mod support for things like console players. And in my eyes, that's where all this leads to. Whenever Space Marine 2 does have an end of service, because that day will come, then you're going to have the community continue to support the game. You're going to have the community continue to make mods where you can play as a Necron Overlord, or as a Custodes, or as a kin from the Leagues of the Votan. And so you're going to have the community continue to make enemies, make different playable mods, like different playable characters, include different heroic weapon variants of their own. Like, the players are going to have the tools to be able to do all these things, and a lot of those mods are going to be available to the console community as well. Because I still think that for Space Marine 2, because it's a very controller-friendly experience, as compared to something like, let's say, Warhammer 40k Darktide, the majority of the player base is on console.
I think we've seen that adding post-launch mod support for consoles has done wonders for games like Skyrim and Fallout 4.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
it'll do the same for this game, and the big worry I have for Space Marine 3 in general is that Space Marine 3 will probably launch with significantly less content than this game has, and because of that, players will probably go back to Space Marine 2 for a while. Like, that's kind of like my worry there, is that Space Marine 2 will probably be the better experience for the dedicated player base once Space Marine 3 comes out on its initial launch. Like, people will play the campaign, they'll play the operations, like potentially new classes, and they'll be like, okay, well, until there's new content, we're gonna play Space Marine 2, because Space Marine 2 will probably still receive some updates while that game is out, because we saw in Space Marine, or excuse me, World War Z, that World War Z still gets updates to this day from Saber, and like that game is not even remotely as popular as Space Marine 2. So if there is a player base for Space Marine 2, we'll probably see updates for both potentially, which would be pretty interesting to see, because I doubt they just want to drop off support entirely, but mod support, that is huge. I think the console players especially have been asking for mods for ages. I imagine the Nintendo Switch will also get that. And like, this really is the next stage of the game's life cycle, like you said before, because with Nintendo Switch getting Space Marine 2 in Christmas, that's like the big push to an entirely new audience.
Oh, yeah. I don't know how it's going to play on the Nintendo Switch 2, but I hope it's fine. But yeah, the main point really is the mod support. The mod support is a huge deal. Like you said, with Skyrim, it has kept Skyrim alive for dozens of years at this point. Like, it is crazy how old that game is. and how it is effectively Bethesda's most successful game because the community continues to keep it alive. We can totally see that happening for Space Marine 2. I don't know. I also don't know what's going to happen with Space Marine 3. What I see, what I kind of am forecasting, and I'll make sure that I'm paying attention to earning reports and everything just to keep the community informed. But I think they're probably going to bolster the team, dude. I think that Space Marine 3 is going to have a significantly larger development team and a significantly larger post launch support team. And I could see them making Space Marine 3 more of a competitive live service, maybe with a similar business model, if not adding a couple of additional levers that they can kind of tug on to create more cash. But basically trying to release content updates like every month, or at least having a significant event in game every month to be able to get players to log in.
I think that Space Marine 3 might just, bite the bullet and put in MTX. I know that might be a
Oh,
controversial
yeah.
thing for some people, but like I really do think that if they want to like push out as much content as the player base actually wants for Space Marine 2, they would probably have to put in MTX, and like that would be the financial incentive for them to do that, because $5 and $8 DLC packs is kind of insane to me. Like we get as much content as we do in Space Marine 2 already for like
Yeah.
such a small amount of DLC really, and like none of it is gameplay related. And we've seen that like every other horde shooter has already done this. So Space Marine 2 is a very consumer friendly game in terms of monetization, but I think we will see that change a little bit in Space Marine 3. And Space Marine 3 will also have new players coming in that like won't feel like, oh, I already bought all these cosmetics. Like they won't really care. So I think Space Marine 3 will also just be a much bigger game because of that.
Hey man, I think the last thing that I have to say about this is Destiny 2 is dead. There are a lot of refugees out there looking for a home.
That's also true.
If Saber wants to capitalize on it, they totally can.
And that is pretty much all we have to say in this one, guys. I mean, let us know what you think about these current state of Space Marine 2. I think the game's in a great spot right now. I think it is the best it has ever been. As we move into year 3, I think year 3 will really just solidify Space Marine 2 as like the premier 40k horde shooter. Obviously, some people might like Dark Tide more, but I think Space Marine 2 is like really just taking that title for itself. And that is all I have to say in this one. Thank you, Jefficus, for coming on to talk about this with me. If you guys want to sub to Jefficus, you can find him in the description below. And as always, if you want to sub to me, you can find me here, obviously. And take it easy, guys. Bye.
The Emperor protects.